Yikes, how about all those readings? I've been reading them, preparing for my sermon, and I'm not sure I've heard them read aloud, one right after the other. And as they were being read, I was thinking about my daughter, what she says when she's having a bad day. She says it's just blow after blow. And that's what I was thinking as I heard those readings and saw the artwork posted. And for some reason, sometimes when I'm preparing a sermon, I read it and I think, what in the world am I going to do? But for some reason this week, that didn't hit me. I sort of moved through it. So we'll see where we go with them. But it's great to see all of y'all, and it's great to be here this morning. So our calendar this past week marked two occasions. Some of you may be aware of them, some of you may not. The first occasion that I noted was the feast day of St. Martin of Tours on November 11th. St. Martin was an early bishop of the church, born around 330 in Hungary. And he grew up in Italy and was conscripted into the Roman army, and then later moved to France and committed his life to the church. There's a well-known story told about St. Martin. So he was serving in the army, and one day he was walking along the road, and he came upon a poor beggar lying in the street who was shivering from the cold. And so St. Martin was moved with compassion, and he took off his cloak, and he took down his sword, and he cut it in two and gave half to the beggar and kept half for himself. So later, the way this story goes, that night, Martin had a dream, and he saw in his dream, he saw Jesus shivering with Martin's half of his cloak over him. And it was at that point in the dream where St. Martin knew that he had met Christ earlier in the day. So St. Martin's feast day, November 11th. There's one more interesting tidbit just to share about that feast day, because I think it's interesting. A long time ago, it used to be that in the season of Advent, it was a longer season and more heavily penitential. And I think it's interesting because, you know, way back then when the church had this longer penitential season, it always began on St. Martin's feast day. So you'll sometimes hear that referred to as a St. Martin's Lent, this long season before the Feast of the Incarnation. So the second occasion this week that was marked, one that maybe you might not be aware of, although if you're in the Friday Bible study, you may be aware of it because they talked about it. But on November 9th and 10th this week was a more sobering occasion that was marked. It marked the days of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. This was when in 1938, over the course of 2 nights, Jewish homes, properties, synagogues, businesses were burned, looted, pillaged, destroyed in Germany and across Austria. Kristallnacht. Jews were arrested and rounded up. Many were sent to ghettos or internment camps, where they then awaited death in a concentration camp. The orders for Kristallnacht came from on high, and there were a series of things that came together that for those on high, they felt like it was the right time to do this. But there were a whole host of local leaders, police, and civilians who participated in this looting. And then there were others who watched, doing nothing. So 2 nights of destruction and terror for the Jews and anyone else that would have been deemed other by the Nazis. And to me, what's so scary and sobering about Kristallnacht is that it wasn't just the few on high that led the way, but it was a whole group of people like you and me who participated in this night of broken glass. Maybe because they had hate, or maybe just because they were simply afraid for their own lives. So we've got St. Martin's feast day and Kristallnacht. And both of those occasions made me start thinking about the question, what do we do with the lives that we're given? What choices do we make, and why do we make them? So Jesus asked this same question in our parable today, the parable of the talents. So you'll remember last week, and it's just before this parable in Matthew 25, we had the parable of the bridesmaids, where judgment, again, this theme of judgment, comes to those who were unprepared for the banquet, those who forgot the oil for their lamps, the ones who threw caution to the wind and then suffered the consequences. Well, in today's parable, interestingly, it's not the reckless ones who get into trouble, it's the cautious one. The one who holds back, who hides his talent in the ground. Just to give a little bit of context here, and Robert talked about this some last week, but just to remind ourselves, we're at a place in Matthew where Jesus is about to make his final trip into Jerusalem, where he's going to suffer rejection, suffering, and we all know death. And he's very aware of this. The disciples maybe not so much. But he's very aware of the shortness of time, of the fleetingness, as the psalm talks about. And so these parables take on this particular sense of urgency, a particular clarity. And that urgency is even greater because Jesus truly was living in a time where he thought, even after his death, the end times would be near, that it wouldn't be long. So there's this great sense of urgency and of clarity in these parables that he's teaching. He's not messing around. He knows he's not going to be with the disciples much longer, and he wants them to understand what he's about. So we get the parable of the bridegrooms last week, and then today we have the parable of the talents. So you'll recall, a man goes on a journey, and before he leaves, he gathers his 3 slaves, and he entrusts them with all of his property. To one, he gives 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1. And interestingly, it says each according to his ability. Now, what you may not know, unless you're a biblical scholar, is that this property that he gave away, that he entrusted them with, was an enormous amount of property. 5 talents would have been the equivalent of 100 years' wages for a worker. So 2 talents would have been like 40 years' wages, and even 1 talent, 20 years. So for each of these workers, what they were given by this landholder, what they were entrusted with, was an enormous sum. And that would have been obvious to anyone listening to this story. So one takes his 5 and heads out and invests it and makes 5 more. And another takes his 2 and makes 2 more. But then we have the one with the 1 talent. And that one does something different. He digs a hole in the ground and he hides it. It doesn't say he buries it, it says he hides it. Now, I don't know with that word if there's any linguistic difference that was intended, but in my mind, bury has a different connotation than hide. Hide seems more explicit, like you're worried about something. Maybe someone's going to take it from you, or maybe you don't trust yourself with it. Maybe he's afraid if he has it, somehow he'll spend it. Or maybe he's afraid to risk the loss. Whatever it is, it's explicit. It says he hides it. And the other thing I wonder about is whether this one with the 1 talent was still chewing on the fact that he'd been given 1 and the others 2 and 5, and each according to their ability. Did he know that was why he got the 1? And did that get under his skin or kind of eat away at him? Whatever it was, this one he holds back. And somehow, for some reason, he comes away from it afraid of the master, the one who had so generously entrusted him with so much. Well, the master comes back and tells the one who made the 5 talents, "Well done, I'll put you in charge of more." And then says, enter into the joy of your master. And then he says to the same who invested their 2 talents, "Well done, I'll put you in charge of more. Enter the joy of your master." And you don't hear any conversation from those 2. You imagine they're very pleased. They please the master, they've done well. But then with this last one, there's a conversation. The master asks him why he buried his talent. And his response is, I knew you to be a harsh man, so I was afraid. And I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here it is. Well, we all know the master's response is uncompromising. You wicked and lazy slave. You ought to have invested it so that on my return, I would at least have gotten something out of it. And then, if that's not bad enough, he takes the talent and he gives it to the others. Yikes. Pretty harsh, pretty in keeping with every other reading we had. What are we to make with this parable? Is it really about winners take all? Those who have more, who make more, get more, and those who don't or who have a little lose what they already have? Is that really what Jesus is trying to say to us? I don't think so, because that doesn't really square with Jesus and with the fact that Jesus in his life and in his ministry, he spent most of his life with the losers, the ones on the margin, the ones who weren't in the places of power, who hadn't been able to get to the top. I don't think this parable really is about money per se, although resources and money and financial resources might be a part of it. I think it's actually about something much broader and something that applies to everyone. It's about how we live our lives, about what we each do, what we do as a community at St. Matthew's, with the abundance that we've been given, the choices that we make, and how we respond or don't respond with our resources to those choices. Of course, judgment's a part of that. It's clear in these lessons. It's clear in these parables. But if we get lost in that piece of it, if we get lost only in the judgment, I think we miss the focus of the parable. And the key to understanding this parable, the key to understanding what's going on, it comes in what follows immediately after it, right at the end of chapter 25 that sums up this whole chapter. And it's this vision that Jesus holds out of the end times, when the Son of Man is going to return and separate out the sheep from the goats. And that separation, that dividing, it's not going to be done based on financial wealth or success or how well you invested your money. It's not going to be done on what you profess to believe or one's level of faith or how one practices it. Jesus doesn't call attention to those things. It's really in this vision that he gives, it's not about any of those things. It's about the measure in which we treat people, the measure in which we share what we have with others out of the abundance of our lives, out of the abundance of grace that God has given us. So those who are blessed, who actually enter into the joy of the Master, are the ones who fed Christ when he was hungry by feeding others, the ones who gave Christ something to drink by sharing a drink with someone who's thirsty, the ones who clothed Christ by sharing the cloak off their back or sharing clothes with the one in need, or who welcomed Christ as a stranger by welcoming the stranger in their lives, or visiting Christ by visiting the ones in prison. These are the ones who Jesus is saying will enter into the joy of the Master. So to go back to the parable of the talents with this key in our mind, the beginning point of our parable, it's the generosity of the giver. Everyone in the parable begins with abundance, even the giver. And the giver entrusts all of his servants with abandon, with generosity, and with this seeming hopefulness for what may come of the generosity. And so the first two servants, they get that. They take that generosity and they turn it outward, they invest it, and then they watch it multiply. But the third didn't seem to get that. Instead, he turned inward. He dug a hole and he hid what he had because he was afraid. He didn't let go, but he held on tight because he was afraid of where it might take him, afraid to go beyond himself, to take a chance, to go beyond his own cares and the things that he worried about, his safety, his world. And so as a result, his world stayed just the same. It stayed very small. There was no change. There was no gain. The two who began from abundance, from hopeful expectation, seemed to have what they needed inside and out to move beyond themselves and invest in a world beyond. The one who was afraid held back. His fear overshadowed everything else, even how he remembered the one who had shared the gift in the first place. In his mind, the master is harsh. And judgment, this business of judgment, well, in a way, for the third one, it becomes its own judgment on itself. If you bury whatever it is you have, whatever it is that falls into your lap, well, then you bury it. You bury it, and there it sits. And your life really turns in on itself. It becomes very small. That becomes its own judgment. It's this paradox of the Christian faith. You will find your life in Christ by losing it. You will find your deepest place with God, your joy with God, outside of yourself. That's the secret. That's the mystery, the paradox of this way of love with Jesus. Enter into the joy of the Master. You all know I've been part of this group organizing for Fest, and we've been getting ready to make these surprise boxes. And so at first, back in September, when we were talking about it, we were all a little nervous because it was a new idea. We weren't sure where it would go or whether anyone would think it was a good idea or even be interested. We just didn't know what to think. But we thought we were just going to put it out there and see. We'd ask for donations in October, and by October 15th, just see where we are and see what would come in. And if none came in, then we just stopped before we even got off the ground and got people feeling too excited about Fest. So we threw out the idea, and people began signing up. I think the first week, maybe we had 10 or 12. And pretty soon we thought we might have enough to make and sell 20 surprise boxes as part of Fest. And then as that October 15th deadline came, people kept signing up, and even after that. And they'd sign up for all kinds of things and all different number of things. And that number of boxes we'd be able to make grew. And I have to tell you, this week at last count, we've had over 1,000 small items committed to go inside these surprise boxes. It's been incredible. Different things, different ideas, different amounts, all shared abundantly by so many people. Generosity overflowing beyond measure, each according to their ability and to what they're able to give. And I think Karen Ireland would say the same thing about the baked goods with Fest. She reports to me that she'd call and ask people, you know, could you bake something like you've made in past years, maybe a cake or a pie? And most times, without a doubt, she'd hear, sure, I'd love to make one. I'll make 5 or 10 or however many. And if people need more, I'll make more. Riches, abundance beyond what we could have imagined. And if that's not all, everything that Fest will bring in is going to be given away. More riches upon riches as we share it with the community. Abundance, generosity that multiplies, that spreads so far beyond itself that the person giving hardly has any idea where it will land. In the parable, it says each was given according to their ability. The root word for ability is dynamis, power. The power within each of us, given to each of us to be given away. We all have it. What will we do with it? Where will we enter the joy of God? I close with an image. It's the ginkgo tree, which right now is in full glorious bloom. Magnificent sunshine yellow fan leaves mellowing with age on their branches, shining in the sunlight. It's the oldest known living species of tree in the world, and we're lucky to have a few around here if you keep your eyes open. So with the ginkgo tree, when their leaves fall, they tend to fall all at once. When it gets cool enough, all the leaves drop mostly at the same time. Some drop early, but the bulk of them come down all at once. And so you're left with this beautiful, deep, mellow, yellow blanket of leaves under the tree, covering your feet, the bare branches still hovering above. And that whole scene, after the leaves have fallen all at once, it's magnificent. It's all in, and you're left with joy. Enter with joy into the kingdom. Go all in. Don't waste time. The kingdom of God is near. It's in your heart and it's in your mind, and you can do it. Amen.